You know, in a world that feels so chaotic, there's something deeply comforting about a place where everyone knows your name. For the town of Cedar Springs, Nebraska, that place was the Wayfarers Light Church. And the man at the center of it all was Pastor Michael Gideon. Picture this, a bright Sunday morning. Sunlight streams through the tall, stained-glass windows, painting the air in colors of deep red and brilliant blue. The church is packed, every wooden pew filled with families in their Sunday best. And at the pulpit, standing tall and calm, is Michael. He wasn't a fire and brimstone preacher. No, his voice was different. It was like warm honey, smooth and strong, and when he spoke, you felt like he was talking directly to you. That morning, he was preaching about redemption, about how no soul is ever too lost to be found. And let me tell you, he knew how to work a room. He'd pause just at the right moment, letting a silence hang in the air that felt holy. You could have heard a pin drop. People leaned forward, hanging on his every word. He wasn't just giving a sermon, he was performing a symphony of hope, and everyone in that room was part of the orchestra. When the final Amen echoed through the chapel, it was like a spell broke. But a good one. People surged forward, not to leave, but to get closer to him. They wanted to shake his hand, touch his sleeve, ask for a prayer. An elderly woman named Betty, her eyes filled with tears, clutched his hand and whispered, "You saved my marriage, Pastor." A young man, new to town, thanked him for making him feel less alone. Michael handled it all with a practiced humility, a gentle smile never leaving his face. He remembered every name, every child's birthday, every recent hardship. He was more than a pastor. He was the town's anchor. And then, the most beautiful moment. His daughter, 12-year-old Abigail, weaved through the crowd and wrapped her arms around his waist. He looked down at her, and the practiced smile vanished, replaced by something that looked real. Something soft and full of love. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, and in that moment, he wasn't the charismatic community leader. He was just a dad. It was a perfect picture. The kind of thing you'd see on a postcard from a place too good to be true. Later, in the quiet of his oak-paneled office, the last echoes of the congregation gone, he sat behind his large desk. The room smelled of old books and lemon polish. On his desk was a family photo, him, his wife Sarah, and Abigail, all laughing. It was the image of a blessed life. The phone on his desk rang, shattering the silence. He picked it up, his voice still warm. "This is Michael." But as he listened, the warmth slowly drained from his face. The gentle crinkles around his eyes smoothed into hard lines. He swiveled his chair to face the window, looking out at the empty, peaceful streets his church called home. His voice dropped to a hushed, almost cold whisper. "No, the transfer hasn't gone through yet. There were complications with the audit. We need to delay the project." He listened for a moment longer, then said, "Just keep them calm. I'll handle it." He hung up. And for a long time, he just sat there in the silent office, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass, a perfect mask over a man who was suddenly, terrifyingly, someone else. That perfect, postcard life I just described? It lasted about 6 days. It was a Tuesday evening. The kind of quiet, ordinary night that you never think you'll remember. Sarah was in the kitchen, pulling a lasagna, Michael's favorite, out of the oven. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the whole house. Abigail was at the dining room table, doodling in the margins of her math homework. And Michael was helping her, pointing to a problem with a pencil, his reading glasses perched on his nose. It was a snapshot of a happy, normal family. The kind of moment that makes all the hard work of life feel worth it. And then, it happened. A sound that was entirely out of place on their quiet, tree-lined street. A knock. Not a friendly, neighborly tap. This was a firm, heavy, official-sounding knock. Boom, boom, boom. It wasn't on the door. It was like a hammer hitting the very foundation of their world. The smile froze on Michael's face. The pencil in his hand stilled. For a split second, his eyes met Sarah's across the room, and in that look, there was no pastor, no pillar of the community. There was only a raw, animal fear. It was gone in a flash, replaced by a strained calm, but Sarah had seen it. She knew. "I'll get it," he said, his voice a little too high. He walked to the front door, and as he did, Sarah and Abigail drifted into the hallway, drawn by a terrible, unspoken dread. Michael took a deep breath, fixed that familiar, gentle smile back on his face, and opened the door. It wasn't a neighbor. It was two men in crisp, dark suits. They stood with a stillness that was deeply unsettling. Behind them, in the street, two more cars were parked, their red and blue lights flashing silently, painting the white siding of their home in pulsing emergency colors. "Michael Gideon," the first agent said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He held up a badge. "FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest." The words didn't seem real. They hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Abigail just stared, her young mind unable to process the scene. Michael, to his credit, didn't break. He became the pastor again. He turned to his family, his face a mask of serene confusion. "It's a misunderstanding," he said, his voice remarkably steady. "It's all a misunderstanding. God is in control." But as the agent began reciting his rights, "You have the right to remain silent." The camera in your mind, the one watching this whole scene, would have dropped its focus down to Michael's hands, held loosely in front of him. And you would have seen them. Not steady, not calm, but trembling. Trembling like a leaf in a storm. So, what happens after the pillar of your community gets led away in handcuffs? The whole world doesn't just stop. It fractures. It splinters into 1,000 different, angry pieces. The news didn't just break in Cedar Springs. It exploded. It was the lead story on the local channel that night. Beloved pastor arrested in massive fraud investigation. You can just imagine the gasps in living rooms all over town. People who had given him their life savings, who had trusted him with their deepest secrets, sat in front of their televisions, their mouths hanging open in pure disbelief. The town split right down the middle. Half the people refused to believe it. "It's a setup," they'd say at the grocery store. "The government is persecuting a man of God." But the other half felt a sickening, cold feeling in their guts. The feeling that they'd been played for fools. The trust that had taken Michael Gideon years to build was crumbling to dust in a single afternoon. 2 days after the arrest, Sarah went to see him in jail. Now, picture this scene. A cold, sterile visitation room, divided by a thick pane of glass. Michael was on the other side, dressed in a bright orange jumpsuit. The suit, the setting, it all stripped away his authority, his power. He looked ordinary and scared. Sarah picked up the phone on her side, her hand shaking. He picked up his. "Michael, look at me," she said, her voice a tight whisper. "Just look at me and tell me the truth. Did you take that money?" And without missing a beat, he looked her right in the eye. "No, Sarah, I did not. I would never." He leaned closer to the glass. "This is a witch hunt. I think Deacon Miller started these rumors. He was always jealous of the church's growth. He's doing the devil's work, and the FBI is falling for it." He was so convincing, so sincere. For a moment, the doubt in Sarah's heart wavered. Maybe it was all a terrible mistake. But then she looked past his eyes, at the little tick in his jaw, a tiny jumping muscle he could never control when he was under pressure. She saw it twitching now. And she knew, in that deep instinctual way a wife knows, that he was lying. Meanwhile, in a federal building across town, the wheels of justice were starting to turn, and they were finding plenty of traction. The prosecution held a press conference. They laid out their initial case, and it was complicated, full of terms like wire fraud and shell corporations. But one of the reporters cut through all the jargon. He asked, in simple terms, where did the money go? The lead prosecutor, a stern woman named Angela Rossi, looked right into the cameras. "In simple terms," she said, "it vanished. $3.8 million, earmarked for a new community center that was never built, was funneled through a series of fake companies. It went from the church's accounts, to a company called Hope Builders, LLC, to another called Divine Foundations Incorporated, and then, poof, Gone. Like it never existed. Back in his cell, Michael's new, high-priced lawyer was trying to stay positive. "It's all circumstantial, Michael," he said, scrolling through the evidence on a tablet. "They can trace the money to these companies, but they can't prove you controlled them. There's no paper trail leading directly to you." And on the surface, Michael nodded, looking reassured. He clung to that little shred of hope his lawyer offered. But later, alone in his cell, lying on the thin, hard mattress, he stared at the concrete ceiling. The financial records were one thing. They were a maze, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out. But as he lay there in the oppressive silence, a colder, sharper fear began to prick at him. The FBI weren't just accountants. They were archaeologists, and they had just started digging. What if they dug too deep? What if they found something older and far more dangerous than just missing money? The house of cards was still standing, but the first, crucial card had just been pulled. And Michael Gideon, the man who built it, could feel the whole structure beginning to sway. You see, a smart investigation is like peeling an onion. The FBI had just peeled back the first layer, the embezzlement, and it was making them cry. But they knew there had to be more underneath. The sheer complexity of those shell companies. It wasn't the work of a first-time offender. It was practiced, elegant, even. And Agent Rossi started to suspect that Pastor Michael's redemption story was the biggest con of all. The break came from a young, tech-savvy agent who couldn't let it go. While everyone else was following the money, he was digging into Michael's church computer. And buried deep in the hard drive, hidden behind layers of encryption with a password that had nothing to do with Scripture, he found it. A single file, labeled simply, Project Phoenix. He called Agent Rossi over. "Boss, you need to see this." The file wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a blueprint. A timeline. It listed names, dates, and locations going back nearly 20 years. It mentioned the church in Cedar Springs, but it also mentioned 2 other towns before it. It was a plan, a method. And the name, Project Phoenix, sent a chill down Rossi's spine. The phoenix is a mythical bird that rises from its own ashes. Was Michael Gideon a man who made himself disappear, only to rise again somewhere new? One name on that list, from his early 20s, was a man named David. David Miller. He was listed as an associate. It took them a week to find him, living in a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of St. Louis, working as a night shift janitor. When agents Rossi and Carter found him, he was terrified. I mean, truly bone-deep terrified. He didn't want to talk. He kept saying, "I left all that behind. I'm clean now." But Rossi, she's gentle but she's firm. She sat at his kitchen table and said, "David, we're not here for you. We're here for Michael. The man you knew as Michael Gideon." The sound of that name made David flinch. He looked at the agents, then at his own worn-out hands, and he started to talk. And the story he told, it was nothing like the inspiring testimony Michael gave from the pulpit. The troubled youth Michael talked about? That was a lie. A sanitized version for the congregation. The truth was darker. The truth was about a young man named Mikey Grady, a charismatic grifter who ran small-time cons with his friend David. Fake charity drives, pyramid schemes, convincing elderly homeowners to pay for roofing repairs they never needed. He had a gift, David said, his voice hollow. He could look you in the eye and make you believe the sky was green. He never got violent, never threatened anyone. He just twisted the truth until it fit what he wanted. And then, about 15 years ago, Mikey Grady had a close call. A state investigator was asking too many questions about one of their roofing scams. And Mikey, he just vanished. He told David he was going to rise from the ashes. David never saw him again. He heard a rumor a few years later that a man with a similar smile was preaching in a small town in Iowa. He'd changed his name. He'd become Michael Gideon. Back in the car, Agent Rossi sat in silence for a long minute. This wasn't just a financial crime anymore. This was a life built on a lie. The respected pastor, the loving husband, the doting father. It was all a character, a role played by a career con man named Mikey Grady. The embezzlement wasn't a one-time fall from grace. It was who he had always been. He hadn't stumbled into sin. He had simply upgraded his game. And that left them with one terrifying question. If the man they knew was a complete fiction, then what else was he capable of? A man who could build a whole new identity from scratch. What lines wouldn't he cross to protect it? The foundation of Michael Gideon's life wasn't just cracked. It was rotten. And they were about to find out what was festering in the dark. So now the FBI had a new picture of their target. He wasn't a pastor who stumbled. He was a career criminal who had simply found the most forgiving audience of his life. Agent Rossi now knew she wasn't just looking for stolen money. She was excavating the entire history of a ghost. And when you go digging in a man's past, you don't always find what you expect. Sometimes, you find what he buried. The agents were back in the war room, the one with the large whiteboards covered in lines and names, and right in the center, the words, Project Phoenix. They were meticulously cross-referencing every financial transaction from the church with events in Michael's timeline. And one transaction, a single massive withdrawal of $250,000 from the Community Center Fund, stuck out. It was dated just over 7 years ago. One of the junior agents, looking through old local news archives, spoke up. "Hey, boss. This is probably nothing, but that date lines up with something. A fire. A really bad one." He turned his monitor around. The headline was from the Cedar Springs Gazette, 7 years ago. Tragedy on Elm Street. Local heiress perishes in house fire. The article was about a woman named Eleanor Davison. She was a recluse, an elderly woman who had inherited a fortune but lived a simple, quiet life. She was also, the article noted, a very devout, very generous member of the Wayfarer's Light. A cold knot tightened in Agent Rossi's stomach. Pull the case file. Now. The official fire marshal's report had ruled it accidental. Faulty wiring in the old home. An open and shut case. But two details now screamed for attention. First, the fire started in the basement, near the electrical panel, and it burned unbelievably hot and fast, so intense that it obliterated the cause. It was the perfect cover for an arson. And second, the timeline. Eleanor Davison had made a promised, massive donation to the community center project the week before she died. That $250,000 withdrawal from the church account happened the day after the fire. The charge of embezzlement was just upgraded to murder. Rossi and Carter drove out to what was left of the Davison house. It was just a crumbling, overgrown foundation now, a skeleton of blackened stone. As they stood there, a neighbor, an old man walking his dog, stopped to talk. "Terrible thing," the man said, shaking his head. "Poor Eleanor. She was a lonely soul. Only person who ever really visited her was that pastor." Rossi's head snapped up. "Pastor Gideon?" "Oh yeah," the man said. "He was real good to her. Saw his car parked out here the afternoon of the fire, even. I remember thinking how kind it was, him checking on her like that." The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying finality. He wasn't just checking on her. He was making sure she was home. The faulty wiring was him. He siphoned her donation, and then he silenced the one person who could expose the theft before the project even broke ground. He didn't just steal from his church. He murdered one of his own flock to cover it up. Back at the jail, when his lawyer told him the new charge, the color drained from Michael's face. This was different. This was a tidal wave. He could feel the walls of his legal defense, and his very life, crumbling around him. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That was an accident. It was an accident." But his performance was slipping. The calm, collected pastor was gone, replaced by a cornered, panicked man. The mask wasn't just cracking, it was falling off and shattering on the floor. And back in their quiet, empty house, Sarah Gideon was doing her own digging. Haunted by the lie in her husband's eyes, she was going through old photo albums, looking for some trace of the man she thought she married. And in the back of the album, tucked behind a picture from their wedding, she found a photograph she didn't remember taking. It was a picture of Michael younger, standing with another man in front of a vintage car. He looked happy, carefree. But it was the background that made her blood run cold. It was the charred, skeletal remains of a house. She turned the photo over. On the back, in Michael's handwriting, was a date. The date of Eleanor Davison's fire. Sarah dropped the photo like it was on fire. She hadn't just married a liar. She had married a monster. And the most terrifying thought of all was now screaming in her mind. If he could do this to a helpless old woman, what was he capable of doing to her and Abigail? For Sarah Gideon, the world had become a funhouse mirror. Every memory, every smile, every tender moment she'd shared with her husband now felt twisted and ugly. That photograph of Michael in front of the burnt house wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a key that unlocked a door in her mind, and behind it was a monster. She couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by the ghosts of her own naivety. So, she started packing. Not for a vacation, but for an escape. She was in the attic, pulling down old suitcases, when she saw it. Tucked away in a corner was a dusty cardboard box labeled, College. Michael's old things. She almost didn't open it. What was the point? But some final, desperate need for closure, made her lift the flaps. Inside were old textbooks, a faded university sweater, and a well-worn leather Bible. His rebellious youth Bible, he'd always called it, the one he'd rediscovered his faith with. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It felt heavy. Too heavy. She opened it, and the pages fell apart exactly at the Book of Psalms. And that's when she saw it. Taped to the inside of the hollowed-out binding was a single, small, tarnished silver key. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was a type of key she'd only seen in movies. A storage locker key. Downstairs, the phone rang. It was the automated system from the county jail. It was Michael's one allowed phone call for the day. Abigail, her face pale and drawn, answered it. Sarah came down the attic stairs, the key burning a hole in her palm, and stood in the hallway, listening. "Daddy." Abigail's voice was so small, so fragile. She was clutching the phone with both hands. Mommy found a picture. Of you. At that burned house. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Abigail's breath hitched. "Daddy, just tell me, please. Did you hurt that lady?" That was the moment. The single, most important moment in their family's history. Hanging on the words of a man trapped in a cage of his own making. Sarah held her breath. She could almost feel the hesitation, the calculation, traveling through the phone line. The old Michael, the master manipulator, would have had a smooth, convincing lie ready. But this Michael was tired. He was cornered. And in that critical second, he slipped. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He just said, "Abigail, baby, you can't believe everything you see." It was the worst possible thing he could have said. It wasn't a denial. It was a dodge. A lawyer's answer. A guilty man's answer. Sarah watched as the last light of hope in her daughter's eyes flickered and died. Abigail's face, once so full of love and admiration for her father, crumpled. It wasn't anger. It was a grief so profound it was silent. She slowly, wordlessly, held the phone out to her mother. Sarah took it. She could hear Michael's panicked breathing on the other end. "Sarah? Sarah, listen to me." She didn't let him finish. She looked down at the tarnished key in her hand, then at her broken daughter. The last thread of her denial snapped. "Goodbye, Michael," she said, her voice eerily calm, a flat line of emotion. She hung up the phone. She didn't slam it. She just placed it gently back in its cradle, the click sounding as final as a judge's gavel. She walked over to Abigail and held her, as her daughter's silent tears finally turned into ragged, heart-wrenching sobs. An hour later, Sarah Gideon was standing in the cool, sterile lobby of the FBI field office. Agent Rossi was coming out to meet her, a question on her face. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply opened her hand, revealing the small, silver key resting on her palm. She looked Agent Rossi directly in the eye, her own eyes clear and dry and resolute. "I think you're looking for this," she said. The mask wasn't just slipping anymore. It had been ripped off, thrown to the ground, and shattered by the two people who had believed in it the most. And in its place was the terrifying, unknown face of the man who had worn it. A man who was now completely and utterly exposed. That small, tarnished key from the hollowed-out Bible was more than just a key. It was a skeleton key, unlocking the deepest, darkest vault of Michael Gideon's soul. Agent Rossi held it in her gloved hand, a tiny, cold piece of metal that felt heavier than lead. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was on the other side of the lock it belonged to would change everything. The storage facility was on the edge of the next county, a place of rolling metal doors and concrete silence. Unit 217. The lock gave way with a loud, metallic clunk that echoed in the empty corridor. Agent Rossi, with a team of 2 other agents behind her, took a deep breath and rolled the door up. It wasn't what they expected. There were no stacks of cash, no gold bars, no expensive paintings. The unit was neat, almost obsessively organized. There were bankers' boxes, stacked in perfect rows. And on a small shelf in the back, a collection of black, hard-bound journals, maybe 24 of them, each with a year written neatly on the spine. Rossi reached for the most recent one. She opened it, and the air left her lungs. It wasn't a diary of thoughts or prayers. It was a ledger, a cold, clinical record of a life built on a lie. The pages were filled with his handwriting, but it wasn't the flowing script he used for sermons. This was sharp, precise, and brutally efficient. She saw financial projections for the church, timelines for gaining the congregation's trust, and notes on specific members. He had profiles on them. Their financial status, their vulnerabilities, their secrets shared in confidence. Next to Betty, the elderly woman, he'd written, "Husband's life insurance, $150,000. Trusts implicitly." Next to the young man new to town, "Inheritance from grandfather. Lonely. Easy to influence." This wasn't pastoral care. It was target acquisition. But the real horror was in the older journals. The ones dating back 15, 20 years. This was Project Phoenix. Page after page detailed his cons from before Cedar Springs, the fake charities, the roofing scams, the fake identities. And each time the law or suspicion got too close, he would document the controlled burn. He would disappear, letting his old life turn to ash, and then he would rise again in a new town, with a new name, a new story. Mikey Grady had to burn so that Michael Gideon could be born. Then Agent Carter, his voice tight, said, "Rossi, look at this." He was holding a journal from 7 years ago, open to the week of the fire. There were sketches of a house's floor plan. Eleanor Davison's house. Notes on her schedule, on the best time to ensure she was home. And a single horrifying line, written so casually it made Rossi's skin crawl. "The donation is secured. The liability must be extinguished. The Phoenix requires ash." He had planned her murder like a business transaction. But the most chilling find of all was in the very last journal. Tucked into the back cover was a single, typewritten list. It was titled, "Future Nests." It was a list of other, larger churches in other states. And at the very bottom of the list, a final, soul-crushing entry that Agent Rossi couldn't even read out loud to the team. It was the name of his own life insurance policy, with Sarah and Abigail as the beneficiaries. He hadn't just planned his next con. He had planned theirs. The pastor was gone. The father was gone. All that was left was the Phoenix. A creature that knew only one truth. In order to live, something else always has to burn. The courthouse in downtown Omaha was surrounded by a media circus. Satellite trucks, reporters doing live stand-ups, and a crowd of onlookers who just wanted to catch a glimpse of the man who had fooled an entire town. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a national spectacle. Inside, the air was thick and still, heavy with anticipation. Michael Gideon was led in, wearing a simple, dark suit. But the suit couldn't hide the change in him. The charismatic glow was gone. He looked thinner, older, his shoulders slumped. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the stares from the public gallery, which was packed with his former congregants, reporters, and in the front row, Sarah and Abigail. They sat perfectly still, their faces unreadable masks. The prosecutor, Angela Rossi, stood up to make her opening statement. She was calm, methodical, and deadly serious. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She simply laid out the horrifying truth of Project Phoenix for the jury, describing it as a blueprint for a predator. She promised to show them the man behind the mask, not through her words, but through his own. And then, the evidence began. One by one, the prosecution laid those black journals on the evidence table. It was a stack of evil. When Rossi held up the one with Eleanor Davison's floor plan, a gasp rippled through the room. But the most powerful moment came when she read from the journals themselves. She read his cold, clinical notes about his own flock. She read his plan to leverage Betty's grief and capitalize on Mark's loneliness. She read the entry, "The Phoenix requires ash," written just days before he set that fatal fire. The jury listened, their faces shifting from curiosity to disgust, then to outright horror. This wasn't a fall from grace. This was a calculated, lifelong campaign of psychological violence. Michael's high-priced lawyer did his best. He argued that the journals were the ravings of a man under immense pressure, that there was no physical proof Michael started the fire. He tried to paint the financial records as a complex web that could have been managed by someone else. But it was useless. How do you argue against a man's own handwritten words? How do you explain away a 20-year plan to exploit and destroy? Every time the defense lawyer spoke, it felt like he was trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. The most devastating moment was when the prosecution called no witnesses to the stand. Instead, they simply entered all the journals into evidence and rested their case. The message was clear: we don't need to convince you. He's already confessed, 1,000 times over, in his own hand. The judge called for a recess. As everyone stood to leave, Michael finally dared to look over at his wife and daughter. He searched their faces for any sign of the love, the faith, the connection that had once been his anchor. But there was nothing. Sarah met his gaze for a single, endless second, and her eyes were as empty as the storage locker that had sealed his fate. Then she turned, took Abigail's hand, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. In that moment, Michael Gideon wasn't just on trial for his life. He was standing in the ruins of it, completely and utterly alone. To see a man's entire life dismantled by his own words, it's chilling. But what would you have done if you were on that jury? Hearing all that evidence, what would your verdict be? Comment below right now. The next day, the entire courtroom expected the defense to call a few character witnesses, maybe a financial expert to try and poke holes in the money trail. It was supposed to be a last, desperate attempt to build some kind of reasonable doubt. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Michael's lawyer stood up and said, "The defense calls Michael Gideon to the stand." A shocked murmur swept through the room. Even the judge looked surprised. It was the riskiest move imaginable. To put a man accused of such monstrous crimes on the stand, to let the prosecutor tear him apart. It was legal suicide. But Michael stood up, straightened his suit, and walked to the witness stand with a strange, eerie calm. He was done hiding. He took the oath, his voice clear and steady. He sat down, folded his hands, and looked out at the courtroom. And then he began to talk. But he didn't defend himself. He didn't deny anything. His lawyer asked the first, soft question. "Michael, did you embezzle money from your church?" "Yes," he said, without a hint of emotion. "Every single dollar I could." The lawyer, looking stunned himself, pressed on. "Did you set the fire that killed Eleanor Davison?" Michael looked directly at the jury. "I did. I poured the accelerant myself. I made sure she was inside." The gasps in the room were sharp, painful. Sarah closed her eyes as if she'd been physically struck. This was the confirmation she had both feared and known was coming. But then, Michael kept going. He took control of the narrative. He started listing crimes the prosecution hadn't even charged him with. A charity scam in Iowa that left dozens penniless. A fake investment scheme in Kansas that ruined a family business. He described the cons with a craftsman's pride, explaining the mechanics of the lies, how he identified the vulnerable, how he gained their trust. He talked about the performance of being a pastor, the cadence of his voice, the carefully chosen words of his sermons, all designed to manipulate. It was a role, he said, his voice flat. The most challenging and rewarding role I ever played. You have to understand. I felt nothing for them. Their pain, their faith. It was all just a tool. A means to an end. The courtroom was utterly silent, held captive by a confession more terrifying than any accusation. Then, the prosecutor, Angela Rossi, stood for cross-examination. She wasn't angry. She was ice-cold. So, you felt nothing for your congregation. What about your family? Was that a performance, too? For the first time, Michael's calm facade flickered. He looked over at Sarah and Abigail, his eyes lingering on his daughter's tear-streaked face. He turned back to Rossi, and the mask was back. It was the most convincing performance of my life, he said, but his voice was quieter now. But in the end, it was just another part of the con. My only regret, my only real mistake, was getting sloppy. I started to enjoy the life I had built. I let myself get comfortable. And that's why I'm sitting here. He had confessed to everything. He had laid his soul bare, and the jury saw it for what it was, not a soul seeking redemption, but a hollow, empty machine built on lies. He hadn't taken the stand to save himself. He had taken it to finally, after a lifetime, tell the truth. And the truth was more damning than any sentence a judge could ever pronounce. There are some days that just feel different the moment you wake up. The air is heavier. The light seems sharper. The day of Michael Gideon's sentencing was one of those days. The courtroom was packed again, but the mood wasn't the electric, gossipy feeling from the start of the trial. This was different. This was a funeral. A funeral for trust, for faith, for an entire community's sense of safety. Michael was led to the defense table. He looked empty, like a shell. The man who had commanded a room with a single smile, who had confessed to his crimes with chilling pride, was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out vessel, waiting to be filled with his fate. The judge, an older man with a weary, lined face, entered the room. Everyone rose. The rustling of clothes and the squeak of shoes sounded deafening in the silence. He sat down, adjusted his robes, and looked out over the courtroom. His gaze was not unkind, but it was heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. The first part of the hearing was the victim impact statements. This is where the legal case becomes human. This is where the numbers and the charges get a face and a voice. One by one, they came forward. Betty, the elderly woman, her voice trembling but clear. "You held my hand at my husband's funeral," she said, not looking at Michael, but at the judge. "You told me God had a plan. And I believed you. Now, the money we saved for 50 years is gone. But worse than that, my peace is gone. The world feels ugly now." Mark, the young man new to town. "I thought you were my friend," he said, his voice thick with anger and hurt. "I gave you my inheritance because you said we were building something together. You weren't building a community center. You were building a tomb for my future." A woman from his first church in Iowa, who had seen her family's business destroyed by one of his early schemes. The list went on. Each story was a brick, building a wall around Michael Gideon, sealing him in with the consequences of his life's work. It was devastating. The air in the room grew thick with shared grief and rage. You could feel the collective heartbreak pressing down on everyone. Through it all, Michael did not move. He didn't look at the people speaking. He stared down at his own hands, cuffed in his lap. He was a statue, a man made of stone. And then it was Sarah's turn. The entire room held its breath. She stood up. She smoothed her simple, dark dress. She walked to the podium. She did not look at her husband. She looked only at the judge, her posture straight, her eyes dry but blazing with a pain so deep it was beyond tears. She didn't read from a paper. She just spoke from a place that was raw and real. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "He didn't just steal money. He didn't just kill a woman. He stole my life. He stole my daughter's father. He took our love, our trust, our memories, and he proved that every single second of it was a lie. She paused, swallowing hard. The man I married never existed. The father my daughter adored was a character in a play. The sentence you give him today, it won't give us our lives back. It won't unbreak our hearts. But it will tell my daughter that the world, for all its darkness, still has justice. And right now, that's the only thing we have left to believe in. She turned and walked back to her seat. She did not look at him. Not once. The judge watched her go, his expression one of profound sadness. He then turned his gaze to the man at the defense table. "Michael Gideon," the judge said, his voice resonating in the quiet. "Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Any final words?" The entire world seemed to lean in. What could he possibly say? What words were left for a man who had used them all as weapons? Michael slowly lifted his head. He looked at the judge. His mouth opened. But no sound came out. When Michael Gideon opened his mouth to speak, nothing came out. It was as if every lie, every performance, every twisted word he had ever uttered had finally dried up and turned to dust in his throat. He simply shook his head, a tiny, defeated motion, and lowered his gaze back to the floor. There was nothing left to say. The truth had already been told, and it had condemned him. The judge nodded slowly. He put on a pair of reading glasses, the lenses catching the light. He looked down at the papers in front of him, then back up at the courtroom. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was absolute. It was the voice of the law, and in that moment, it was the voice of God. "Michael Gideon," he began, "this court has heard the evidence. We have heard the testimony of your victims. We have read, in your own hand, the meticulously planned destruction of the lives you pretended to shepherd." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the silent room. "The crimes you have been convicted of are not merely illegal. They are a fundamental betrayal. A betrayal of trust, of faith, of the sacred duty you claim to uphold. You did not steal from a corporation. You stole from widows and retirees. You did not just commit arson. You murdered a vulnerable woman who saw you as her spiritual guardian. You weaponized the divine, and in doing so, you caused damage that this court cannot possibly quantify." He then picked up a single sheet of paper. The sentencing document. "Therefore, on the count of wire fraud, this court sentences you to a term of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." He moved to the next line, his voice steady and relentless. "On the count of securities fraud, 25 years. A rhythm began. A terrible, crushing rhythm. On the count of mail fraud, 15 years. On the count of money laundering, 30 years. The numbers started to stack up. The air grew thicker. People in the gallery were unconsciously holding their breath. Michael didn't move. On the count of aggravated arson, 40 years. A sharp intake of breath from someone in the room. The judge's eyes lifted from the paper and locked onto Michael. The final charge. "And on the count of murder in the first degree, the court sentences you to a term of life in prison." He set the paper down. The silence was so profound you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. "However," the judge continued, his voice dropping to a tone of ultimate finality, "given the unique and heinous nature of these crimes, their duration, and their profound impact on the community and the very concept of faith, it is the judgment of this court that these sentences shall not run concurrently. They shall be served one after the other." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "The total term of imprisonment is hereby set at no less than 200 years. For a moment, nothing. The number just hung in the air. 200 years. It wasn't a life sentence. It was an eternity sentence. It was a message carved in stone. Your life, your works, your very existence, are so irredeemable that we must measure your punishment in centuries." Michael's head stayed down. He was completely still, as if he hadn't heard. As if his mind, his very soul, was trying to process a number that had no connection to human life. It was a mathematical abstraction of justice. A verdict not just on his crimes, but on the entirety of the man who committed them. The judge brought down his gavel. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. It was over. After the gavel fell, there was a moment of perfect, suspended silence. The number, 200 years, just hung in the air, a mathematical ghost. It was so vast, so final, that the human mind couldn't really grasp it. It was a verdict on his soul, not just his life. And Michael Gideon just sat there. He didn't move. He didn't cry out. He didn't collapse. He simply stared at the grain of the wooden table in front of him, his head still bowed. It was as if the sentence was so massive, so earth-shattering, that it had a gravity all its own, pinning him in place. The courtroom began to stir. People were getting up, reporters were rushing for the doors, the soft sounds of movement and whispered conversation starting to fill the room. But at the defense table, time stood still. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, said something quiet into his ear. Michael gave no indication he heard him. He was doing the math. Not with a calculator, but with his life. 20 years was a young man becoming middle-aged. 40 years was a full career. A lifetime was 70, 80, 90 years. 200 years. That was his life, lived 2.5 times over. It was his grandfather, born in a world of horse and carriage, living to see a man walk on the moon. It was the time it takes for a sapling to become a giant, ancient oak. It was an epoch. It was a measure of time meant for civilizations, not for a man. And in that silent, brutal calculation, something broke. It started as a tiny, almost imperceptible shudder that ran through his shoulders. Then a sharp, choked gasp escaped his lips, a sound like a man drowning on dry land. He clamped a hand over his mouth, as if to physically shove the emotion back down, but it was too late. The dam had cracked. His entire body began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. His shoulders hunched, curling in on themselves as if trying to protect a fatal wound. A low, guttural moan welled up from somewhere deep inside him, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that had nothing to do with prison cells or years. And then the tears came. They weren't the graceful tears of a remorseful man. They were ugly, raw, and helpless. They streamed down his face, his features contorting into a mask of utter despair. He collapsed forward, his forehead hitting the cool wood of the table with a soft thud. His body was racked with sobs so powerful they looked like they were tearing him apart from the inside. He wasn't crying for his lost freedom. He was crying because the number had made him truly understand, for the very first time, the infinite weight of what he had done. He was heard over and over, whispering into the wood, his voice broken and shattered. My God, what have I done? This was the breakdown the world had been waiting for. But it wasn't what anyone expected. There was no performance in it. No manipulation. This was the real Michael Gideon, the man who had been buried under 40 years of lies, finally being exposed to the light. And the light was burning him to ash. The two bailiffs moved in, their faces professionally neutral. They had a job to do. They gently pulled him to his feet. He offered no resistance. He was a marionette with its strings cut. His legs could barely hold him. He stumbled between them, his head hanging, his body still shaking with these deep, soul-wrenching sobs. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at his family. He was gone, lost in a private hell of his own making. The courtroom doors swung shut behind him. But the sound of his weeping seemed to echo in the sudden quiet, a ghost of a man who had just been sentenced to disappear. In the weeks and months that followed, life in Cedar Springs went on. But it was different. The heart of the town had been ripped out, and something else, something colder and more cynical, had been stitched in its place. If you were to walk down Hemlock Street, you'd see it. The Wayfarers' Light Church stood with its doors locked, its windows dark. A faded for sale sign was staked into the lawn, tilting slightly as if it, too, had given up. Weeds sprouted through the cracks in the parking lot. The place wasn't just closed, it was hollow. A shell haunted by the ghost of a beautiful lie. Sarah and Abigail Gideon were gone. They packed what little they could bear to keep and moved to a small city in another state, a place where no one knew their name or their story. Sarah found work as a receptionist. Abigail enrolled in a new school, where she told no one about her father. They were trying to build a new life from the ashes of the old one, but the shadow of Michael Gideon was a long one. It followed them in the quiet moments, in the way Sarah would flinch at a sudden noise, or the way Abigail would look at her friends' fathers with a mixture of sadness and suspicion. And Michael? He was in a maximum security prison, a place of concrete and steel and constant noise, a world away from the quiet pews of his church. He was just a number now. He spent his days in the prison library, not reading law books trying to find a way out, but reading theology. The very scriptures he had once twisted for profit, he now read with a desperate, hungry intensity. It was as if he was searching for something he had pretended to understand his whole life. Guards reported he never had visitors, never caused trouble. He was a ghost in the system, a man serving a sentence so long it had erased his identity. For a while, the story made the rounds on national news. The crying pastor gets 200 years. But news cycles turn. Bigger stories emerged. The world, for the most part, forgot about Michael Gideon. But in Cedar Springs, and in the hearts of his family, the echo of what he did remained. It was in the empty pew where Betty used to sit, who now found it too painful to go to any church. It was in the trust that was broken between neighbors, who now wondered what secrets lay behind each other's smiles. The story seemed to be over. Justice had been served. A monster had been put in a cage. But a haunting question remained, a whisper in that empty church. What were those tears in the courtroom really for? Were they for Eleanor Davison? For Betty? For Sarah and Abigail? Or were they, in the end, just for himself? The man who had lost everything, including the one person he'd ever truly cared about, the fictional character of Pastor Michael Gideon. Years have a way of smoothing out even the sharpest edges of a story. A decade after the trial, a young journalist named Ben managed to do what no one else had. He secured a sit-down interview with Michael Gideon. The man Ben met in the prison visiting room wasn't the charismatic pastor or the sobbing convict. He was an old man, his hair white, his eyes holding a deep, settled weariness. But he was calm, and he agreed to talk. Ben asked all the expected questions about the crimes, the lies, the money. Michael answered with a startling, brutal honesty, as if he'd been rehearsing the truth for 10 years in his cell. But as the interview was winding down, Ben asked the question everyone still wondered about. "That day in the courtroom," Ben said gently, "when you broke down after the sentence. The whole world saw it. What was happening in that moment? Was it the 200 years? Was it fear?" Michael was silent for a long time, looking at his aged, gnarled hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but clear. "No," he said. "It wasn't the number. It was the silence." He looked up, and his eyes were focused on a memory only he could see. "All my life," he continued, "I had this wall inside me, a barrier between me and everything. Other people's pain, their joy, their love. It was all just noise. Data to be used. I thought it made me strong. I thought it made me smart." He took a slow breath. But when that judge said, 200 years, that wall, it just vanished. It didn't crack. It didn't crumble. It was just gone. And for one single, terrifying second, there was no wall. There was no filter. His voice dropped to a whisper. And I felt it. All of it. Every ounce of pain I had ever caused. Betty's grief, Mark's betrayal, Eleanor's terror, and Sarah's heartbreak. My daughter's shattered life. It all hit me at once. It was like being burned alive from the inside out. Those tears, that wasn't me crying. That was the sound of my soul being flooded after a lifetime of drought. He looked directly at Ben, his gaze unwavering. The sentence was 200 years. But my punishment was that 1 second of clarity. It was the most real, the most human, I have ever been in my entire life. And I will spend every single day of these 200 years trying, and failing, to get back to that feeling. The interview ended. Ben left the prison, the cold air feeling sharp and clean. He finally understood. Michael Gideon's hell wasn't the prison cell. It was the memory of the one moment he wasn't a monster, and the devastating knowledge that he could never be that man again. 15 years into his sentence, a routine was all Michael Gideon had left. The same concrete walls, the same clanging doors, the same hollow silence. He had no expectation of it ever changing. But one Tuesday afternoon, a guard grunted his name and told him he had a visitor. He assumed it was the journalist, Ben, following up. He shuffled into the visitor's room, his gaze already dropping to the floor. But when he looked up through the thick glass, his heart stopped. It was Abigail. She was a woman now, in her late 20s. Her face had lost its soft childhood roundness, replaced by a quiet strength and a profound sadness that seemed etched around her eyes. She was beautiful. She was a stranger. And she was his daughter. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone on his side of the glass. She did the same. He couldn't speak. His throat was sealed shut by a lifetime of regret. Abigail looked at him, not with the hatred he deserved, but with a weary, final kind of peace. "I'm not here for answers," she said, her voice calm and clear. "And I'm not here for an apology." She took a slow breath. "I'm here to tell you something. I forgave you. I forgave you a long time ago." A single, disbelieving tear escaped from Michael's eye. "But you need to understand something," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for me. So I could sleep at night. So I could have a life and a family, and not carry this poison inside me anymore. I forgave you so that I could live." She looked at him for a long, final moment, as if laying down a burden she'd carried for far too long. "Goodbye, Dad." She hung up the phone. She stood, gave him one last, sorrowful look, and then she turned and walked out of his life forever. Michael sat there, the dead phone pressed to his ear. The silent sobs that racked his old body were not for his lost freedom, or his ruined reputation. They were for the incredible, undeserved grace his daughter had just offered him, and for the crushing finality of knowing it was the first and last time he would ever truly see the woman she had become. Time, eventually, claims everyone. Even the stories that once captivated a nation grow old and fade, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies. The story of the crying pastor was officially over on a cold, gray morning, 32 years into his 200-year sentence. The news didn't come with fanfare. It was a 2-line obituary in the digital archive of a small Nebraska newspaper, submitted by an anonymous source. It didn't mention his crimes. It didn't mention the trial. It simply read, "Michael Gideon, 78. Former pastor of the Wayfarers Light Church in Cedar Springs. Predeceased by his parents." That was it. A life of monstrous complexity, reduced to a single, sanitized sentence. The warden found him. He had passed quietly in his sleep in his cell, an old man whose body had simply given out long before his sentence ever could. His few personal effects were gathered. There were no letters, no photographs of family. There was only a well-worn, leather-bound Bible, the same one from the storage locker, and a single piece of paper on his small desk. On the paper, in a handwriting that had grown shaky with age, was a line of scripture. It was only half finished. He had written, "The wages of sin is death, but the gift." The verse, from the book of Romans, continues, "But the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord." He had written the condemnation, but he had never written the redemption. The sentence was complete, but the grace remained unfinished. A national news outlet, running a segment on infamous criminals from the past, picked up the story of his death. They framed it as the final chapter for the tearful pastor. For one more day, his name was in the headlines. And then, like a stone dropped into a deep lake, it sank back into the silence, leaving only ripples of a question behind for those who still remembered. A question about a man who spent his final decades staring at a blank space on a page, trying to find a word he could never quite bring himself to write. Years later, in a sun-drenched backyard 1,000 miles from Cedar Springs, Sarah Gideon knelt in her garden. Her hands, now lined with age, were buried in the rich, dark soil, tending to her roses. The lines on her face weren't just from age, but from a peace that had been hard won. She looked up as her daughter Abigail walked out onto the grass, holding the hand of a small, laughing boy, Sarah's grandson. The child ran to his grandmother, his tiny hands reaching for a bright yellow bloom. Sarah scooped him up, and his laughter was the purest sound in the world. It was a sound that held no echoes of the past. Later, as the sun set, Abigail watched her mother and her son, and she felt the chain. The chain of trauma, of lies, of a poison that had traveled through generations, was broken. Her father's legacy would not be inherited here. This child would only know love, and safety, and truth. So, what was the real sentence for Michael Gideon? The 200 years were just a number. A symbol. His true punishment wasn't the prison cell. It was the unbearable weight of his own conscience, a weight he only felt for a few seconds in that courtroom. It was the memory of his daughter's forgiveness, a gift he could never truly possess. It was knowing that the world, and the family he broke, had healed and moved on without him. The story of the crying pastor forces us to ask a difficult question. Where does redemption truly begin? Is it in a courtroom breakdown? In a lifetime of imprisonment? Or is it in the quiet, steadfast courage of those left behind to pick up the pieces? Maybe redemption wasn't for Michael at all. Maybe it was for Sarah, finding peace in a garden. For Abigail, breaking the cycle with her own child. Their healing was the gift that his sentence made possible. A terrible, painful, heartbreaking gift, but a gift nonetheless. And in the end, that was the final, quiet twist. The man who spent his life taking ultimately gave them the one thing they needed most. The freedom to let him go, and the strength to build a new world, one where his silence was finally, blessedly, just silence.